maybe best for me to very quickly rehearse this question, why it is so important that we recognize the role of cities as part of the broader developmental agenda as we move into the 2020s. And I'm going to structure this into three very simple points. The first about the social or socioeconomic, the second around the environmental, and the third around governance. So back to, I think, a first proper justification why we cannot avoid talking about cities when we think about development, global development more generally. Economists for long have established that cities are engines for prosperity, and often there is a very succinct and specific role of urban conditions for social progress on all sorts of different parameters. Urban contexts are also an an innovation space which is enabling socio-technical transitions. But then we get into the realm where we're also detecting difficulties. We are, of course, increasingly recognizing that poverty is not just a rural phenomenon, but that this also does happen in cities, and urban poverty needs to be taken head on, and that there are new proximities between very unequal lives and livelihoods. And then there's not just the inequality in between and within cities, but beyond cities. Cities are engine of growth, but also they can be superstar cities. They can suck a lot of air out of regional economies and possibly leave some of the national hinterlands behind. On the environmental point, cities clearly provide the physical proximity, which is so important for resource efficiency and for then addressing a whole range of major environmental concerns, not least the climate equation. The more we are really developing our city systems around these efficiency gains, the better, and a lot has happened already over the last decades. Cities also concentrate risks as well as opportunity. The highly sort of optimized type of systems which really need to operate in a fine-tuned manner can easily be disrupted and then escalate all sorts of crises, which we have, of course, also seen under the COVID conditions. And finally, on the governance perspective, we could consider cities as a form of governance, local governance in particular, a form that allows us to be more connected with the lives of people on the ground. The mayors, the city officials, those that are dealing with public policy at the city level are often much more connected to what is happening in people's lives. And cities have shown on many occasions that they have become key players also for very complex global issues. So that's, of course, partially a reason why we have also dedicated sustainable development goals, focusing on the urban with the SDG 11, something we may want to come back to. And yet at the same time, today, 5-6 years after the SDGs were rolled out, our progress is incredibly slow. COVID-19 has been offering new systemic challenges on top. And then there's the climate emergency lurking just behind COVID, which raises all sorts of very, very difficult question about future urban development. Now, I'm coming to the structure for tonight. We'll have first 45 minutes of listening, where we have 3 times 15 minutes from our guests, and then between 30 and 40 minutes, an open Q&A. But I'd like to urge all of you to already, throughout the talks, make use of the Q&A function, which allows you to not just document your questions, which I can then take later on, but you can then also rate or add, so to speak, points to different questions others have raised, so we know which ones are sort of the more urgent or important ones, at least based on the assessment of our audience tonight. Now, let me come to our speakers. I'll introduce all 3 of them in one go, and then we'll start one by one with the presentations. The first panelist is Stefano Marta. He's a program director, a coordinator at the Cities and Urban Policies and Sustainable Development Division at the OECD. And he will be focusing on COVID-19 specifically, and then also the broader SDG perspective. We also have Gundula Löffler with us. She's a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, and she will focus on the financing role for urban sustainability, and in particular in relation to infrastructure projects, absolutely central. And then we have Oluwafemi, who allowed me to call him Femi later on, Olajide, who is a lecturer for the Development of Urban and Regional Planning, Department, sorry, of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Lagos. He's calling in today from New Zealand, far away, and he will be looking more from an academic angle at the specific urban realities of Lagos. So a really exciting mix of different perspectives, also from very different geographies. So let's start with Stefano. 15 minutes, over to you. You need to unmute, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Rod, for the nice introduction, and thank you to all the team of the London Development Symposium for the invitation. Let me quickly share my screen with the presentation. So here you go. So basically what I would like to present tonight is the OECD perspective on urban development, and in particular the impact of COVID-19 on urban development, and also the opportunities that COVID-19 is offering for the development of cities. And then I will focus on the role of cities for what the professor mentioned as being the main global agenda for sustainable development currently, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. And I will present some results of the OECD work on this area, and also how our territorial approach to the SDGs can offer a framework for cities to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. So at OECD, we started working on COVID-19 as many organizations since March last year. And based on a report that we are about to publish, we identified 10 key lessons that we can derive from the pandemic and that are relevant for urban development and for cities. My presentation will focus in particular on the lesson number 10, but I will guide you quickly through all the others because I think they are really relevant to provide the global framework and some insight for a new paradigm for urban development. First of all, I think we need to stress that cities are on the front line for the responses to COVID-19 crisis because they have two main roles. One is that they can be implementer of nationwide measures, but also they provide laboratories for bottom-up and innovative recovery strategies. So basically the COVID-19, we think at OECD, accelerated the shift towards a new urban paradigm, towards a more inclusive, green and smart cities. The 10 lessons are, the first is that while COVID-19 has had an asymmetrical impact across territories, the initial policy responses were place blind. So they were not really taking into account the territory. And therefore, this is why we are recommending the OECD to go towards place-based, context-specific policies to respond to the pandemic. Second lesson is that COVID-19 started as a health crisis and turned into an unprecedented economic and social shock with a big impact on cities. We can see that many big cities like Paris, Milan, New York, and so on were the ones that were most hit by the crisis. The third point is that while most of the world was in lockdown, we rediscovered the importance and the need to shift from the concept of mobility, the concept of accessibility in urban development. Then, fourth point, COVID-19 was an eye-opener to all forms of inequality across people, places, especially in large cities. And this is also linked to the fifth point that we believe that density is not the real problem. The real problem is persistent inequality within city and the quality of urbanization. And we think that the urban premium will likely not turn into an urban penalty. Sixth point is the key role of digitalization. Digitalization has started to change the future of work in cities and our relationship to productivity, demography, and mobility. But at the same time, there are some challenges, is that not everybody has access to digitalization. You can see even in OECD countries like Italy, for example, that there are huge territorial disparity in the access to internet, for example. The seventh point is the combination of the Zoom effect, so the pandemic that doesn't allow us to travel, basically, and the great effect have accelerated citizens' environmental awareness, and this can really play an important role to move towards circular economy, green recovery, and so on. The 8th point is that COVID-19 holds implications for governance and citizens' trust in their government. In particular, what is really important is the concept of multi-level governance, because we saw that in many OECD countries, the countries that were effective in the responses to the crisis were the ones that managed to coordinate well across levels of government between the city, the region, and the national government. Then while the COVID-19 is new, the concept of resilience to shock or to disaster is not a new concept. So there is already a lot of literature and material we can build on to develop and consolidate the concept of resilience. Finally, point number 10, the one that I'm going to develop throughout the presentation, is that global agenda, in particular the SDGs, has never been so important because they offer a clear path, a long-term vision, and also a sort of a tool, a common language to bring together different stakeholders from the public sector, the private sector, civil society, NGO, to work all together towards the recovery from COVID-19. So in terms of SDG, what are we doing, particularly in my division of cities, urban policy, and sustainable development? We launched a program called a Territorial Approach to SDGs that has the objective to support cities and regions, although the presentation will focus mainly on city. We also work on regions to implement the sustainable development goals and to support them using the SDGs not as a agenda where cities and regions and national government, they only have to report, but as a policy making tool. So not as a compliance agenda, but as a tool for policy making. And the importance of cities for the SDGs, it can be stressed by some facts. The first one is that at OECD, with our work, we estimate that the SDGs, at least 65% of the target of the Sustainable Development Goals will not be achieved if cities and regions are not engaged into the implementation of the SDGs. Second point, as Professor Rod mentioned, there is one SDG, SDG 11, that is on city. But our idea, the message that we want to convey with this program is that we need to go beyond SDG 11 because cities has implication for most of the 17 SDGs. So the idea is really to provide a city lens to all the SDGs. And then we also know that 60% of public investment in OECD countries are under responsibility of local and regional governments. So they have responsibility for a big chunk of the public investment that are relevant for the SDGs, from infrastructure to water, sanitation, and so on. So what we are doing at OECD is to work with 11 cities and regions that you can see in the slide. We have, for example, cities like the city of Bonn in Germany, the city of Kitakyushu in Japan, the city of the metropolitan area of Rhein-Neckar, that is the area around Mannheim, the municipality of Kopavogur, the city of Moscow, among the cities. With them, what we are doing first is we are doing some policy dialogue to understand how they can use the SDGs to improve the local development plan, policy, and strategy. Then we have developed an OECD localized indicator framework that is helping us to measure for all the 600 and all cities and all the 600 regional OECD countries to measure progress on the SDGs. And then we also have created a community of practice with our OECD roundtable on cities and regions for SDGs, where all these stakeholders can exchange knowledge and information on how to implement the SDGs in cities. We started this project with 3 key assumptions. The first was that the SDGs are, even if they were designed not specifically for cities and regions, but mainly for national government, they should be a shared responsibility across levels of government. And during the project started in July 2018, so 2 years and a half ago. We saw that there are many countries like Japan, Germany in particular, that are using the Sustainable Development Goals to improve the multi-level governance. So this coordination between cities, regions, and national government, that is so key also for the responses to the pandemic. Then the importance of going granular in terms of measurement beyond national average. We saw with the previous big development agenda, the Millennium Development Goals, that national average very often can mask some pocket of poverty or inequality in specific territories. So the idea here is really to go beyond this national average and capture this territorial within country disparity. And here I will mention later that, for example, 80% of the region and 70% of the city are not on track to achieve the SDGs. And this idea also to go beyond the compliance agenda with the SDGs. So for sure, the SDGs represent an agenda where the government at various levels of government can report, and they are doing so using, for example, the national voluntary reviews or the voluntary local reviews that cities are more and more producing. But the key opportunity of the SDGs is to use them as a policy making tool for urban development, because they are really a tool that can allow policymakers to work to break silos and work implement this multi-sectoral approach, or to work with the private sector, the civil society, and also to provide a framework for measuring the progress on sustainable development. This is what we have been doing at OECD, so to produce this OECD indicator framework with 130 and plus indicators that are OECD and place relevant, because we did a screening out of the big list of indicators produced by the UN, and we saw that these 135 more or less indicators are the ones that are relevant for cities and for regions, and they are relevant for OECD countries. For some SDGs, you can see that we have a high coverage, for example, for SDG 8 on decent work, or for SDG 16 on peace and institution, while for others, like SDG 14 or SDG 12 on sustainable consumption and production, the coverage is lower, but still we can measure the progress in all the 17 SDGs. Some result of this, out of this indicator framework, are that cities and regions on average in OECD countries are not on track to achieve the SDGs. Most of them, they have not achieved the values in any of the SDGs. In particular, cities lag particularly behind in terms of climate, biodiversity, and energy. And both cities and regions lag behind in the gender-related target. But at the same time, despite this bad news, the good news is that cities and regions are starting using the SDGs as a policy-making tool, and I will present a couple of examples at the end of the presentation. Here is how we are presenting the result in terms of measuring the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals at city level. And again, we can see that in some of the SDGs, like SDG 9 on industry and innovation, cities are lagging very much behind, or also in SDG 17 on partnership, while for SDG 2 on food security, or SDG 4 on education, or SDG 16 on peace and quality of institution, cities are doing quite well. The main challenge are for cities, the environmental SDGs, and this is a very important message, also considering the Green Deal and the recovery from COVID-19. The SDGs where most cities lag behind relate to SDG 13 on climate and to SDG 15 on life on land. SDGs on clean energy is the one, 7 on clean energy is the one that displays the highest disparity in terms of the distance to achieve the target across cities in OECD countries. And as I was mentioning, gender is also a big challenge for city and region. While there are only, we see that there are only 3 cities in Finland, 1 in Lithuania, 1 in Germany, that are on track in terms of gender, SDG 5, gender equality. So this is really something where cities and local policymakers should work on. Here is the example that I was mentioning. Some city where we are working on, like the city of Bonn or the city of Kitakyushu in Japan, are doing a lot of work on using the SDGs as a policy-making tool. What they are doing exactly, the city of Bonn in Germany is implementing, using the SDGs to implement the sustainability strategy that they developed for the first time last year. And in particular, they really use it for breaking the silos between different policy areas. And they are trying to understand how the SDGs can be used to manage the trade-off between the climate objective, the need to provide affordable housing, so a social objective, and inequality in the city of Bonn, and also the need to provide green spaces in the city. So they really try to connect the very concretely, the three-dimensional sustainable development in the city. The city of Kitakyushu in Japan is doing something similar. In particular, the city is trying to understand how the environment.
Stefano, just to highlight, we have 1 minute left. Thank you. Go ahead.
you. This is my last slide. The city of Kitakyushu in Japan is trying to understand how their main strengths in terms of SDGs, so the environmental component, like clean energy, circular economy, and so on, can provide opportunities to address some of the social and economic development challenges in the economic and social sphere. So this is what we are doing with this project and with this pilot work. Just to conclude, these lessons and what I've been mentioning tonight are collected in the OECD report, the Territorial Approach to the SDGs, that you can find at the following link. And this report also includes a checklist for public action to localize the SDGs. And more, we are now working. We also have the web tool where you can find all these different performance on the SDGs at city level. You just need to, for example, put Greater London, as you can see, and you will see how London is performing in the 17 goal. So more and more moving forward, we are connecting this work to the COVID-19 recovery. We organized the OSDG roundtable in November, and the focus was very much on how these lessons on implementing the SDGs at local level can help cities to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I mean, for those of you that have been dealing with the SDGs in the past, this is such a sort of positive overview in the sense that finally we are getting the metrics going and understand also at the subnational level whether we are living up to our promises. And unfortunately, Stefano, you are also confirming we are lagging behind in relation to our 2030 goals. But it's good to see particularly those areas where cities are up to speed. And these comparative overviews are absolutely fascinating, comparing national, regional, and city level and their progress. Big congratulations on this program. I'm sure many of us will be looking into your report very soon. Let's come to finance with Gundula. And as I said before, in parallel already, please submit your questions so we can then immediately after the next two presentations get to the Q&A. Gundula, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Philip, and thank you to the Symposium team for organizing this really interesting series of panels, and to all the participants. Hello, I'm going to share my presentation with you. All right. There we go. So, just going to minimize this. Great. So I'm going to talk to you today about financing sustainable urban development. And to start with, the first question is, so why is urban finance important? Well, it is, of course, very crucial to finance the urban development that is necessary to accommodate the huge growth in cities that we see today. So as you know, the world is rapidly urbanizing. We're currently at about 56% of the world population living in cities, and we're expecting to see about 60% of the world population living in cities by 2030, in less than 10 years. This rapid urbanization is primarily driven still today by like rural urban migration. And especially in developing countries, you often see sort of the poor segments of the population living in rural areas, also often low, like with low skill levels, moving to cities in pursuit of better earning opportunities, which obviously also has important ramifications for the inequality that might increase through that mechanism in the cities. We continue to see a large share of the population living, of urban populations living in slums, or in slum-like informal areas, even though this phenomenon maybe has improved a little bit over the last 20 years, but it still remains a huge issue in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, about 56% of the population, of the urban population, lives in slum-like environments. And so you see this whole urban growth, sometimes chaotic, unplanned urban growth, puts in tremendous pressure on cities to provide urban infrastructure, first of all, but also, where possible, affordable housing for the poor segments of the population moving in. And so that is a challenge that cities face. And in order to meet those challenges, they need a sound financing strategy that can help provide these urban services and urban infrastructure needed. All right, so where does the money come from? When we think of urban finance, immediately our head travels to urban infrastructure financing, so in urban investments in large infrastructure, which is of course an important aspect of it, and especially with the urban growth going on, continuous infrastructure development and expansion is extremely important. But there's also the other aspect, which is the recurrent funding necessary to fund urban services, for example, or to run urban services, to implement them. For example, schools, nurseries, health centers. You need funding to finance salaries, operational costs, etc. And even the infrastructure that seems to be to run itself, like streets and water piping systems, etc. This also requires, of course, recurrent funding in order to ensure maintenance and operations and repair, because if this is not taken care of, then this infrastructure will decay much more quickly and fall into dysfunction. And will need to be replaced. So from a sustainability aspect, this recurrent funding this side of things in order to pay for operations, maintenance, and repair is extremely important. And the two should always be looked at in conjunction with each other. Another source of finance, besides from the city, there's always also the dimension to think about that cities can also benefit from especially large urban cities and capital cities can benefit from national investments in large scale of infrastructure, like airports and so on, which are investments that are usually out of the control of the cities, and they have very sometimes limited influence on how they look like, but this is also something to keep in mind. All right, so now I'm going to speak about some of the main finance sources for cities. Probably in most developing countries, the most important source for cities are still the intergovernmental grants. Cities are often highly dependent on those transfers from the central government to local government and to cities, both for infrastructure investment, but also for service delivery and operations of urban services. These grants can take different forms. They can come completely unconditionally, meaning just big chunk of money handed to the cities for them to allocate as they see fit. But oftentimes those grants are also have certain conditionalities attached to them, meaning that rules about how they can be spent, what they can be spent on, and these rules can be quite general as to this is a grant only for infrastructure, only for salaries, for example, for wages, but sometimes the outcome also vary with a lot of detail. Basically the planning and budgeting happens at the central level, and cities are just handed this instruction booklet on how to spend the money, and there is very little discretion left on the city level to the extent they can decide on the spending. yes, funds obviously come from the national government revenue, but also from donor funds. That's often an important source. They usually use different mechanisms for allocating the funds across different cities or local governments. There's sort of the gold standard today, and which is increasingly used in many countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, is formula-based, using objective criteria to allocate intergovernmental transfers to different localities. This obviously gives, once the overall funding envelope is known, a lot of transparency and clarity to the cities. They will know exactly how much money they will receive if those objective formulas are applied. However, there should be mentioned that often there is a more or less explicit bias against urban areas in those formulas, because the central government often sees cities as being, more financial autonomous and being able to collect more revenue on their own. So they will, give preference to rural areas. So that's something just to keep in mind. And then obviously there's also other allocation criteria, which might be more driven by political an implicit criteria rather than objective ones. Intergovernmental grants can vary in their stability and their reliability, which obviously has implications for the financial flows and for the reliability for the cities. I mean, whether they will know when to receive the funds and how much they will receive. If funds are really unstable, for example, vary a lot from year to year, that can constitute a problem for cities in their efforts to plan ahead beyond just the next year. So the specific grant design often depends, or always depends actually, on the broader intergovernmental fiscal arrangements that exist in the particular country. So an individual city is often not really able to influence the overall grant architecture, unless, of course, they pair up with other local governments in some form of national association and engage in a dialogue with the central government over these issues. I need to move faster, so I will. Own source revenue is, especially for urban areas, an important source of revenue. They can often generate substantive amounts, although they are often used mostly for recurrent expenditures, either operating costs for the administration or also for service delivery, and rarely are enough to really fund infrastructure financing. You have your local taxes, which local taxes often are sort of land-based or based on local economic activity. They can be potentially be very productive. The most well-known one, of course, is the property tax, which can yield substantive amounts if implemented well, but it's actually quite difficult to do that well, and many developing countries struggle with that. So oftentimes a lot of the potential is not tapped, so the cities don't manage to tap the full potential. There's also often local cities have a large number of small payment fees, parking fees and market access fees, etc., that are paid by many people. However, which makes it administratively quite burdensome to collect. And then, of course, you have usual user charges, which are in exchange for urban services like water, electricity, although that's often central level service, depends. your bus tickets, for example, for using city transportation. And these charges are supposed to cover the unit cost of the use of these services. However, often that's not the case. So in fact, the services still need to be subsidized, and because the user charges can't cover the full cost, there's also potential for cross-subsidization between income groups, depending on how you structure the fee system. Yes, but all in all, for local own source revenue, there are often important administrative challenges for cities. Many cities have still quite old-fashioned tax administration system in place, which is very staff intensive, requires basically a lot of people going around collecting small amounts of money from citizens, which is also very prone to corruption. So all in all, it's a big construction site for cities to work on. Then, of course, the big important source for infrastructure financing is debt financing. That's a financing approach that is used routinely in OECD countries and developed countries. And there's an increasing number of cities also in the developing world making use of that financing approach for infrastructure investments. However, it's not as common as you would think. There are a number of hurdles. One important one being that not all cities are legally, or I should say, not in all countries are cities legally allowed to take on debt. I mean, sometimes there is, the central government bars that, bars cities from taking on debt, or in places where it is allowed in principle, there's still central government permission on a case-by-case basis required, which sometimes isn't granted out of principle because central government is mostly concerned with expenditure control and very, very cautious about potential bankruptcy of local governments, because if that happens, there's no choice but for the central government, but to bail local governments out, and that can become very, very costly.
Gundula, we have 1 minute left.
Yes, 1 minute left only. Oh my God. Okay, so then let me just go to can I have 2 more minutes and I'll finish in 3?
Try to do it fast.
Okay, I will do it fast.
We want to have a discussion. It's important.
Yes. All right. So, so basically, debt financing can work, but doesn't always work for local governments, for cities in developing countries. I will skip over the public-private partnership and just making 2 final points. One is, so, as you've seen, there is this whole range of different funding sources that cities can draw from, and they're patched together in quite a complex way. Also, resources can't always be used, they're not fungible. So, there's specific rules attached to them and specific purposes. So this is something that cities really need to manage properly in order to be able to finance everything that they want to finance, especially given the resource constraints that they face. And in order to do this effectively, they need to collaborate with and coordinate and negotiate with lots of different stakeholders. They can't just solve this by sitting in their offices. They need to speak to central government agencies, to private contractors, to private financiers, to development partners, to all these different actors. And final point, cities also always need to be seen within the intergovernmental legal and institutional context that they operate in, and so does their funding. So, and this context, this can be empowering or restraining, depending on the nature of the intergovernmental structure. But it is important for cities to always sort of maximize and push their discretion that they have available and make the most of it. And, you know, if it's not enough, then also team up with other local governments and other cities and try to increase their autonomy to the extent possible. All right.
Gundula, thank you very much. I mean, such an important issue, and I think it became clear to everyone that the urban finance challenge hasn't been, you know, fully dealt with yet. And even under normal circumstances, without major crises, it is an issue which in most contexts is very unsatisfactory. And many cities continue to lobby hard for bigger reforms, for tax raising powers, as you have said. And maybe in the discussion, we can also come back to some particularly innovative forms of municipal finance. Before that, let's move to Lagos with Femi, who will give us a real sort of deep dive into the specific context of Lagos, which, you know, the city itself doesn't need an introduction, possibly one of the most complex ones and also largest ones in the world. So looking forward to your perspective. Femi, over to you. Femi, are you there? We can see your presentation. It's not in full view yet. Again, Femi, can you hear us? Can I also check with our colleagues at the LSE?
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Sorry, maybe that was a microphone.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
your presentation is not full screen yet, so please blow it up and then go on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you have it in full presentation now?
Perfect. Yes.
Full presentation now.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm Femi, and I'm a lecturer at the University of Lagos. So today I'll be focusing on the specific case of Lagos, talking about development paradox and the livelihood of the urban poor in Lagos. So, and to start with, I would say, as Philipp said, Lagos is not Lagos is a popular one in Nigeria and African context, so to say. So, and to set my presentation in context, I will be looking at Nigeria and Lagos as a context, and look at Lagos, looking at the different conflicting rationalities of people and the government development priority, and at the same time look at some of the paradoxes coming out and the tension, and also look at how my way actually go forward within this context. So as a matter of introduction, Nigeria, as we know, is the most populous nation in Africa, and the largest economy, rich in oil and gas, but poverty is on the increase as well, despite all this impressive outcome. And at the same time, also looking at Lagos, Lagos is the most urbanized conurbation in Nigeria and the economic capital of Nigeria. But despite this impressive outlook, about 2/3 is actually informal, either from settlement point of view or from economic point of view. And at the same time, poverty is significant in this context. And when we look at government development priority, is narrowly conceived, probably focusing on the minute portion of the society. Therefore, Lagos is a polarized city, or city of polarity, as I will call it, with a lot of conflict, where you see wealth and poverty coexisting side by side, as you can see in the background picture. And at the same time, we can see that as people try to organize themselves, particularly the urban poor, So they make their living or their livelihood with limited asset base and within unsupported institutional framework, because it's more like the institutional framework deliberately targeting to actually make urban poor to live with unsustainable or to achieve unsustainable development outcome, because the regulatory framework not really supporting the urban poor. And at the same time, the polarity, we can see that formal and informal, they coexist side by side within the context of Lagos. So on the left side, we could see very organized settlement, and on the right side, we could see informal settlement. It's just the reality that Lagos we have to face all the time. Therefore, informality is a doubting reality from economic point of view and from settlement point of view. But this informal settlement or economy, they contribute a large chunk of revenue for the state. However, they are not recognized, probably because it is not structured. So contrary to this reality of Lagos and the reality of the majority, the development priority of government actually focuses on we can remodel Lagos, leaving out the poor. And this is connected to the assumption that Africa is rising, is the last development frontier, and a lot of speculative urbanism. Therefore, the city government, particularly Lagos, strategically position itself to attract foreign direct investment, to attract foreign financing, to attract foreign investor to develop the city, and also to overcome the challenges of the past in terms of infrastructure development, and particularly occasioned through the long term of military rule in Nigeria. So when the new government came, I mean, the civilian government came, so the effort was, oh, how can we remodel the city, particularly for Lagos? And this has been focusing on getting international funding to do most of the development. So the city is actually rapidly going through a process of urban transformation to be integrated into the global economy. So the development priority of Lagos seems to situate itself within the modernization agenda, globalization, and neoliberalism, so that they can be connected to global political economy and get the finance. So now I want to say that this is not peculiar to Lagos. It's something that is probably going on around Africa, most of the African large cities or the capital cities. So they're also experiencing the go to Nairobi, Kigali. You almost see like a replication of what is happening in a particular city, talking about getting foreign finance. And a typical example in Lagos is the Eco-Atlantic city, which is practically developing the sea, filling the sea and developing a city which we aim that it would be like Dubai, it would be like Dubai-like situation. So therefore, we can say the city moving from managerial to entrepreneur city, from people driven to market driven. So market logic seems to be dictating most of the decision of government, how government can make profit, leaving behind the large percentage of the population. Therefore, the urban development agenda of the state government, which was very documented between 2012 and is meant to guide the city up to 2025. The agenda is to make Lagos the African model megacity and a global economic and financial hub that is safe, secure, and functional and productive for everybody. And the policy thrust is actually to reduce poverty. So, and they were trying to do this through a series of urban renewal, urban regeneration, urban development, talking about like Lekki Free Trade Zone, Eco-Atlantic City, new market model like store-like, removing the open market and the traditional market and trying to remodel them. So, and the intention is that all of this can come together to reduce poverty and to make Lagos a better place that can compete globally with any city in the developed world. So, as I said, that the idea is that Lagos can be like another Dubai in Africa with Eco-Atlantic city. So all of these developments are actually going on. And the intention of the government is that Lagos will ultimately be a city where life is sustainable, where the expectation of those who live there and those who come to do business will be safe and everybody can meet their need. Well-intended vision, which is connected to sustainable development. And at the same time, they reduce poverty that is connected to the poor. So this is well-rounded within the context of sustainable development. However, when we look at the implementation, it's a different ball game where we see paradox in the city. So on the one hand, informality is a doubting reality. But on the other hand, the implementation of the development strategy of government seems to be anti-informality. Informality policies. And with this, we see a lot of implications on the livelihood of the poor, and we see tensions coming out from the people probably trying to counter the market logic, which seems to take precedence over the social logic. So, and the result of this urban development is that on the one hand, the city is becoming more beautiful with the regeneration and redevelopment. But on the other hand, we see the consequence on the livelihood of the urban poor through accumulation by dispossession, because there are a lot of relocation, a lot of spatial displacement, social exclusion, forced eviction, and loss of livelihood. And most of the time, people are not relocated. So they just displaced without any relocation plan. And at the same time, as we see this, we can see that it's like urban poor are deliberately targeted, particularly in prime locations that give them access to livelihood opportunity. So government believe that, well, probably they are not good paying tenants, so they don't need to stay in those prime locations. It's like waste of urban land when they reside there. So the best thing is to demolish those settlements and rebuild it probably for middle class and the upper class. So leaving the urban poor to sort themselves out within the urban context. And this is not limited to settlement alone. We see it in market. The open market are being remodeled. But when they are remodeled, the urban poor who originally occupied this open market, they have no place within the remodeled market. So they are left on their own to sort out themselves, which is actually increasing poverty for them. And the reality for the urban poor is that, well, the plan to beautify city is good. New city, they are good. But the problem is that for an average person, an urban poor, where would they be and where would they sleep? What would be the implication on them? So that is the reality for the urban poor. And moving forward on this. So look, moving forward on this, we see that trying to take off the screen, yeah. So moving forward on this, we see a lot of that contradiction between what people want and what government is doing. So why government or the state government intend to enhance economic and socioeconomic benefits and reduce poverty, but in the actual sense or in reality, the development outcome are rather worsening the already precarious condition of the urban poor. So just to bring out some points and to conclude. So what I've seen based on my own study over time is that the action of the state government actually contradicts the lively reality of the majority. And at the same time, it contradicts the whole essence of sustainable urban development and poverty alleviation as government intended to do. But the outcome contradicts all of this, but reflect an agenda deliberately targeting to probably further improvise the poor. So, and what we see is the tension coming out that the urban poor, through social movement, they're coming out to counter or like insurgent citizen, which is gradually coming up now. But to which extent that is resulting to benefiting the poor is one of the things I'm tracking at the moment. And probably at the moment, I've submitted a paper on that, which is under review. And I will be willing to share it as soon as it is published, So, and I said, for Lagos to actually achieve its megacity aspiration in reducing poverty, what will be important is that Lagos needs to question itself, or the government needs to bring up a question for itself. Is urban modernity bad? Well, I want to say that urban modernity may not be bad, but as the city government thinks strategically, globally, they also need to look inward, locally in the implementation, so that the reality can be captured into the development plan. And at the same time, I want to argue that the current development strategy needs to be remodeled to capture the urban poor in a way they can leverage on their strength and their asset to use the asset more productively rather than pushing them out of the city. So finally, I want to say that to do this successfully, there must be co-production and public participation, that people must be brought on the table to actually discuss and engage constructively with the government. But the question which I want to leave with us is that, how do we get public to participate effectively, even despite that, okay, there's rising of social movement now, and it's one of the areas that I'm also tracking at the moment. And I think a book chapter is submitted on that based on the preliminary findings. And as soon as this is ready, I'll be willing to share it as well. So at this point, I want to stop so that we can have more time to engage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Femi. This was so helpful on multiple points. It allowed us to really ground the discussion in this extreme case of Lagos, and with the images you have added, it allowed us to really do exactly that. And you know, as you say, it's incredibly hard to think beyond the paradox if you see development proposals like Eco Atlantic happening, you know, a mile away from places where informal settlements are being constructed in the water and people are living very, very difficult lives. But we must get back to also your provocation to argue that a lot of it could be addressed in a more coherent way if there was greater participation. So let's open this up. We have about 30 minutes left. Not that many questions yet, although we have a first one where a lot of others felt this is really important to address. I also have a few questions, and you know, if we have time, we can also go around the panel to allow for following up on individual points that were made before. But let's start with Lara Geriani, and this is a question for Femi. To what extent does the modernization paradigm affect locals' ability to afford the new city? Do you think that local residents are faced with unsustainably rising prices? What's your response to that? Femi, over to you.
Okay, yeah. I think in one of my slides that I showed, to people, they don't really have a problem with modernization, developing new cities. But the problem is that how are they accommodated within this new city that are coming up around Lagos? Definitely, the urban poor are not accommodated because most of the developments, particularly let's take example of housing, they are not affordable to the urban poor. So when those settlements are demolished or they are forcibly evicted, what they do is that they go to create another informal settlement somewhere because they are not accommodated within the plan. So it's making the city more unaffordable for them. And this is not sustainable on the long run. Though the city might become more beautiful in some locations, I mean prime locations, but the agenda of sustainable development goes beyond environmental. We need to look at the socioeconomic of the people as well. How are they brought in? So the city is becoming unaffordable for the people. And this also came out in one of the studies I just completed now, talking about the social movement and right to the city. So issue of affordability was a major discussion within that project. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now I want to construct a bridge, an intellectual bridge to Gundula's point on finance. And, you know, if we stood back and if, you know, we wouldn't know a lot about economics and public policy and the things we all work on, and you get this story being told about Lagos, where, you know, it's actually on many accounts a relatively rich city, certainly within the wider region, and it has incredibly affluent residents for sure. If you stood back from all of this, you would very simply argue, well, it's a problem of the tax base. You know, we need to extract far more money from those that have resources, that live wealthy lives, help the city to then have extended finance and roll out a public housing program, a public infrastructure program, and start building all of this. Now, we of course know Nigeria is a context which has heavily also ideologically looked into sort of a market-based ideology. So this would be maybe the first argument against it. But I kind of wonder, Femi, do you, and then also Gundula, do you actually, can you imagine a situation where without strengthening the state, without increasing the tax base, and ultimately without a lot of new public finance, you can get to this point of greater equity and a reduction in poverty? So Femi first.
Is that
and then
for me or for?
Yeah, Femi first, you,
okay.
Because you know your local context, and then we'll hear from Gundula in relation to her broader finance work.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that. Oh, definitely, city needs finance and money to actually develop even sustainably or for equity and redistribution. But the thing is this, in terms of the tax base, I know that Lagos is actually coming up gradually now to increase the tax base, though the city is largely informal, and there's little that can actually be gotten from the informal activity. But more and more, those people work in the informal sector, they are coming to the tax net gradually. Before, what has been the problem was that people don't see the result of the taxes they pay. So there's that, attitude from people that when you pay the tax, what would they do with it? So it's better not to pay it. And because government does not have that effective mechanism to actually collect all the taxes. But I can remember that during the time of a particular governor in Lagos, talking about Governor Fashola, there was that increase in the tax base that even those people work in the informal sector, willingly, they were coming out to the government that they want to pay their taxes because probably they saw some work being done by government. But as it is now, because of that lack of accountability within the system, so there's that apathy from people to pay their taxes. And if government does not get taxes, the next thing they are looking at is, okay, well, we can go to introduce market logic. Let's go for foreign direct investment. And when they come with capital, but they have a different agenda. It's to make profit, not really for the average citizen. So it becomes problematic to actually balance that idea of the entrepreneur and also the socioeconomic reality of the local people is a challenge to balance that. So most of the time, government goes on the way of the market logic.
Yes, and so Gundula, you also emphasized already the traditional concern often in relation to urban finance, particularly in developing world countries, that it's often equated maybe unfairly with corrupt practices, and there's a great nervousness of increasing public budgets. But what's your general response to the sort of question I posed?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is definitely a tricky situation. I mean, I think that in order to achieve more poverty eradication and do more social program, you do need more funding. And the question is whether that can come from local taxes. Yeah, it's not easy. Like, I mean, you said that, okay, that one way could be to introduce like a redistributive tax system where you tax the rich. And obviously there are quite a lot of rich who are willing to invest a lot of money into making Lagos large and beautiful. So they could be paying a fair share in taxes to pay for then social programs and social housing and other welfare projects for the urban poor, of which there are plenty. The problem is, of course, the political economy behind that, which taxing the elites and at local, like both at the national but also the local level, is extremely difficult. I mean, they will never really allow this for these taxes to be raised on them to the extent that would be necessary. So it's, yeah, whether that's going to work or not is rather questionable. You were speaking about sort of innovative financing mechanisms that potentially, with also some sort of market aspect to it. And I mean, it's worked in New York and in other places potentially where you sort of, like, given that, provided that the Lagos city government has enough of a regulatory power to sort of direct investors, or to request investors to say, okay, you can implement your nice flashy projects at the waterfront, but in return you have to, for example, build a certain percentage of the housing for lower income people, and have this sort of like this mixed sort of level of social strata. So provision for housing for these different levels. This is something that could maybe work, depending on whether, but the most important thing there, of course, is also political will. I mean, if the decision makers at the city level are not interested in putting that kind of pressure on the investors, then this is not going to work. But it could potentially be something. Yeah, other than that, well, I'll leave it at that, and maybe we can get to the other questions later.
Yes, thank you very much. So let's come to the second question, which is coming up here. It's by Sarah Mertens, and I want to use this to bring Stefano back into the picture. This may not be an obvious choice, but let's just read out the question and then I'll connect it. So in the post-colonial context, how should institutions in the global north approach cities from the south in regards to aid programs, research, policy making? Now, the OECD is a club of rich nations, but you have recently expanded your memberships. Mexico is already part of it. Colombia is about to, or already more or less part of. So there must be an awareness of, that very difficult question, the relationship between then the richer countries. And of course, you're rolling out your research, you're rolling out your programs. Now, you're not a bank, you're not directly financing like the World Bank, any of these initiatives. But I would expect there's a quite live discussion also within your cities unit about, how do we deal with this relationship between global north and global south?
I think this is really a key question, and I really thank the participant, because in particular in my division, we started very recently a project on city-to-city partnerships to promote sustainable development to achieve the SDGs. Or in other words, on the role of decentralized development cooperation to achieve the sustainable development goals. Decentralized development cooperation is basically the collaboration between cities and regions in OECD countries and cities and regions in developing countries. So it's a sort of development cooperation tool, instrument that is growing more and more. And now in terms of ODA, it represents basically 6% of the total ODA. So still is not a huge amount, but very relevant. And it's also interesting because it has been growing in the last 20 years, despite the financial crisis. And but what is even more important is really, and this is what the question is asking, the way the cities and regions are approaching in developed countries, are approaching the cities in the south. And what is emerging is an approach, a paradigm where we need to go beyond this north-south, rich-poor approach, where the cities in the north are providing help and financial support to the cities in the south. but the new approach is an approach where it's a peer-to-peer learning. So it's a mutual beneficial relationship where the cities in the north are providing some help, sometimes in terms of ODA, so financial flows, but more often in terms of knowledge and peer-to-peer exchanges. But they are also getting a lot out of this collaboration, out of this partnership, because they are learning also from similar challenges that maybe cities like Lagos is experiences, and the big city in the north can also learn from this. We have been seeing at the city there are in particular some key sectors like waste management, circular economy, or water and health, where the city in the north and the city in the south are more and more working together. And another very important element that is emerging from this new approach to city collaboration is the idea of a territorial network approach. So it's not just the local administration, so it's not just the city government that is working with another city government, but the city government is involving the private sector, the NGO, and maybe the municipal company that are working on health or waste management. And they are bringing them on board in this exchange of knowledge between the city in the north and the city in the south. And in particular in sector where cities have a comparative advantage. For example, we are working in Tuscany, and they were focusing very much on circular economy and health, because these are the sectors where they have a comparative advantage in terms of local development in their territories. And the last point, what is also very relevant, is the SDGs as a framework to connect the two, the city in the north and the city in the south, because the SDGs are finally a global agenda. They are not like the MDG, only an agenda for the south. So also OECD countries, they need to progress and report on the SDGs. And therefore, this universality of the agenda represents a framework, a tool for cities to work together, basically.
Thank you, Stefano. And let's now shift to a perspective which for our audience should be particularly important, which is that of knowledge institutions, universities, whether it's for research or indeed teaching. And Femi, I mean, a lot is happening in this space. Clearly, universities throughout the world in very different regions are also catching up, and it's no longer the sort of exclusive dominance of northern institutions. And I'm just curious to see how you witnessed these shifts where all of a sudden there are research programs, educational programs, where really one collaborates amongst partners. And there is a degree of, certainly retreating from the language of the North is assisting or helping the global South. How is this playing out from your perspective in a university context? You're on mute.
Thank you so much for that. So personally, I would say that probably in the last few years, there has been that shift in terms of, because before the narrative has always been that where the North is the gatekeeper of knowledge, leaving the South behind, or thinking that where there's nothing to look into the global South, particularly Africa. But now the paradigm is actually changing with a lot of capacity coming out of the global South, and thinking that we need to actually decolonize our knowledge production. And because of that narrative that has actually started in some years back as well, looking at Africa as the next frontier of development. So a whole lot of effort is coming to Africa. Probably people trying to tap into what is likely to happen in the near future. And with this, we see a whole lot of capacity coming out of that space, that people are no more focusing on teaching. Because within the university system, there are three aspects that university expect: probably teaching, research, and at the same time, community engagement. But before, the focus has been on teaching, teach students with little, but now the space has become so enormous that we see a whole lot of development partners from the global North wanting to collaborate with people. Even I can see that even in some developed countries like the UK, there are a lot of different programs that for you to get those funding, you must just collaborate with people from developing countries. you must get a partner from there. So the space is becoming very wide, and it's changing the dynamics and the narrative in terms of the knowledge production. And with that, we are able to look more inward into our specific problems rather than people from outside to talk about the specific problem, which they may not have the understanding of the context.
Thank you very much. And I guess a big question then
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does indeed. And I just have a quick follow-up question. I mean, we have here my colleague from the Overseas Development Institute. This event is organized by the London School of Economics and its colleagues in London. Besides, of course, in some areas still being sort of equipped with resources which establish the research partnerships, where do you see the future of the intellectual contribution of those groups from outside the country, from outside the region? Because I think you pointed out quite rightly that the connection to the community and the university as an urban citizen on the ground, you know, is very limited for an outside organization. So I'm just curious to see, where do you see the added value besides tapping into, of course, resources, financial resources?
You mean from the global north? I mean,
yeah,
partners from the global north,
where they can, you know, ODIs, OECD type of outfits.
Okay, yeah. So I think if this partnership or the engagement continues the way it's going, it can be more productive for both the global north and the global south. Maybe speaking specifically about Africa now, in African cities, it will be more productive because, as I said, usually what happens before is that from the global north, people try to sit down and try to write about African cities, maybe based on what they know without the local context. But now with this partnership, I see a more productive engagement with the problem rather than working out the problem in isolation. So because locally, there are a lot of capacity that have been developed in terms of resource now compared to what it was some years back. But now there's a lot of capacity. So we can only look forward to a better engagement between, and in terms of, because one of the challenge that we had before is in terms of probably the theoretical framework. How do you develop that? So, but with knowledge also coming from the developed countries and connecting to local people, the capacity has been developed in that area. So it can be a win-win situation because OECD wants to reduce poverty, needs to address the issue of sustainable development. And all of this will manifest locally. So we can always tap into the knowledge of the local people in collaboration with those people bringing the research funding and working together, setting a particular framework where people can work. This will produce a better outcome for everybody, I think.
Thank you very much, Femi. And we have one final question by Ayesha Johnson, which brings us back to the point of finance. And maybe Gundula, if you want to open this up. I mean, there's a question about how could we utilize the wealth of the diaspora returning to their countries through, you know, new types of finance. Has this been a specific topic as part of your work? Would be interesting to hear. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, actually. I myself haven't done any specific work on this, but I'm aware that so remittances, basically payments from diaspora back to the mother country, so to say, is like a very important and dynamic way of financing urban development, not only, but also just community development in general. Money gets, I mean, there's huge, these are really huge amounts of remittances that are being sent back, and not only to private households, but often also given to you know, like NGOs, community organizations, and so on. Sometimes even there are even formal government partnerships being built, and money is given to city governments or even national governments to really develop, to jointly develop development projects. And so this is provides a huge potential. There's quite some interesting experience and evidence on that already in all across Latin America, also North Africa on this area, and also with regards to actual developing infrastructure for the communities that were left by the migrants originally. And so yeah, I mean, it's very important, and I think it could also be a very good mechanism for cities to actively seek out and target these groups and see if these partnerships can be shaped in order to really direct urban development. And obviously you automatically have some sort of community grounding and community engagement, which will also ensure that the money is then not spent in some lofty investment project, but something that will really benefit the community. So I think this has huge potential.
Thank you, Gundula. We don't have a lot of time. We have exhausted the questions that were submitted, but I want to do one final round, and I have sort of my own questions for each of you. And if you keep it rather brief, then we will be able to end on time. So Stefano, my question for you, with all this very valuable work on progress on the SDGs, how cities and regions compare, what has been the biggest surprise to you and your team? What's the bit where you felt like, oh, wow, we need to double check whether that's the case? Would be interesting to hear from you.
I think one, I will mention two, one in terms of data and progress, and one in terms of political commitment. In terms of data, there is a sort of paradox, because we can see that in Europe in particular, we did a survey with the European Committee of Regions, and when we talk about sustainability SDGs, there is still a strong bias towards the environment. So the priority are the environmental SDGs. But at the same time, if you look at the SDGs where cities and regions are mostly lagging behind, these are the environmental SDGs. So there is a sort of paradox there that need to be reconciled with some progress. At the same time, we see that in other countries, like in Latin America, the strong priority are the social SDGs. So there is also priority, of course, depending on the level of development. And the other big surprise for me in terms of political commitment is the commitment of mayors, in particular, even more than regions, towards the sustainable development goals. Because starting with New York, 2 years ago, New York launched this movement of cities producing voluntary local reviews on the SDGs. And now there is even in the UK, Bristol, and there are cities all over the world that are producing voluntary local reviews. This is a voluntary mechanism because cities don't have to report on the SDGs, but they see the value of the SDGs as a policy making tool, and they are more and more reporting and mobilizing all the stakeholders on this point.
Great, thank you very much, Stefano. And Femi, in your case, I think you made such a strong pitch at the end that participation is going to be the road to greater equity. And I'm curious to see, what's your almost a theory of change? So a bit more or much more participation. How is this ultimately dealing with elite capture and the fact that, you know, a lot of wealth is ultimately being insulated from being shared more equally amongst Lagos residents? How is the participation then really triggering the big shift which the city and the country hasn't been able to get to, or at least over the last decades?
Yeah, in terms of participation, I'll look at it from the local community, which is what I've been focusing on in the last few years now, 2 years. Now, is that there seems to be a kind of awareness now from the local community in terms of understanding the contradictions of urban development, where the poor are getting poorer or they're being affected by the development or aspiration of the state. So the local community are organizing themselves now more than what it was before. So there are a lot of local different organizations like the SDI is working now in Lagos very effectively. So trying to engage the government in terms of the development approach, trying to see how they can have access to urban development benefits and right to the city. But what I've seen based on my preliminary findings on this is that there's a kind of power dynamics within the governance space of participation. With this, most of those invited spaces of participation are not actually producing a good outcome for the urban poor to actually effectively participate within the system. So as a result of that, the urban poor, I mean, the deprived community, they're also using the invented spaces, maybe like protests, or probably to organize themselves like local savings or contribution to develop some infrastructure within their community. But engaging the government so far has not really produced much outcome based on my findings. Yeah. So this needs to actually be strengthened the more, because it's the way to go. People just need to come to the governance space to participate.
Thank you very much, Femi. A lot, of course, remains to be tested and trialed in that space. And Gundula, for you, what I thought it would be an interesting question. As part of your work, you will have encountered a lot of financing instruments. Which ones which were maybe a bit off center ground, maybe a bit of a wild card, did you find particularly intriguing, maybe relevant even though that they are maybe at this point complete niches, whether it's a form of tax revenue raising or a form of insuring cities? Was there any form of finance which resonated a lot in relation to the work you have recently been doing?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I mean, I think that the remittance payments can be actually, it's quite innovative and an interesting approach that we already discussed. Yeah, I'm torn when it comes to public-private partnerships. I mean, not just for these sort of ideological reasons, or also the sort of very imbalanced outcomes that Femi has just described very clearly. It's just very hard to find projects that actually have mutual benefits both to the investors who are at the end of the day looking at their bottom line, and to the citizens and the with their particular needs, and especially if you want to keep an eye also on the equity aspects of it and the affordability of access of these services. So I think a lot of these instruments, they can work in the context, but don't always work everywhere. So I don't think there is an instrument per se that can be is going to bring the silver bullet here, but it's unfortunately always looking very carefully at the context, at the political dynamics that are in play, the dynamic of the economy, of the sort of the resource space available, and then just figure out by negotiating and discussing with different stakeholders what can be the best way to go forward. It's a very tailor-made approach.
Great, Gundula. Thank you very much. Now, we have run out of time, but I would like to thank all our participants and, of course, our wonderful presenters. And back to Sarah's provocation, Sarah Mertens, on the sort of post-colonial perspective. It was interesting to see, on the one hand, Stefano with the OECD approach talk about the SDGs. Now, keep in mind, this is the extension of the Millennium Development Goals, which were initially prepared for a context beyond the OECD. So we are bringing back that kind of thinking into the global north, which is so valuable. We have seen Femi making a very strong point about localizing the thinking, localizing the research, and understanding in particular a university as a citizen on the ground, embedded in its city context. And with Gundula's approach to finance, once again, a reminder of these very entrenched problems, which are not then unique to any particular geographic context. And therefore, talking very horizontally across the different geographies that are represented is something which the city discourse, the urban discourse, may allow us to do a bit better than if we operate and only think at the level of nation states, where then sort of the broad differences are maybe more pronounced, or at least perceived to be. So thank you all, have a good evening, and do of course get back to the London Development Forum. They're offering a lot of great events, and I want to also thank all the colleagues on their end that have been involved in preparing this, and therefore a quick round of applause. Wonderful to have so many enthusiastic students and colleagues that make these events possible. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.